You are listening to Aim Higher, a Catholic podcast designed to instruct and to encourage the daily practice of our faith.
Oxit bonum, peace and good to you all. Welcome to another episode of Aim Higher. I am Sister Catherine, and joining me today is His Excellency, Most Reverend Giles Butler, OFM, which means we're going to talk about another virtue. We're in another month, the month of May, and the virtue of the month for May is meekness. So before I get into what meekness is, are you ready, Your Excellency?
Ready or not, here we come.
There we go. Well, taken from the book, A Year with the Saints, there are a couple of quotes that stood out to me, but do you think we should take from the quote or define what meekness is first?
Well, let's define meekness and then we'll take the quotes.
Okay, wonderfully enough, my Catholic faith has the example or the explanation, the definition for us. What is meekness? Meekness is that moral virtue which disposes us to control anger when offended and resentment when rebuked. Meekness, however, must be distinguished from, I can't pronounce that word.
Pusillanimity.
Yeah, thank you. Which is weakness of spirit and cowardliness.
Okay.
Shall I continue? I mean, it does have a nice section on it, or you can find it on page 90 in My Catholic Faith, lesson 45.
Okay.
Then the quote.
Let's have a quote.
Okay. Ooh, there's two that really stood out. There was actually a lot in this chapter. Maybe we could just find a way to introduce both. So I'm going to take the one from St. Francis de Sales first. Resist your impatience faithfully, practicing not only with reason, but even against reason, holy courtesy and sweetness to all, but especially those who weary you the most. I'm sure you can speak on it from experience on that one, Your Excellency.
Okay. So our Lord says, learn of me, for I'm meek and humble of heart. And so I picture all the abuse that our Lord had to suffer and how he suffered in silence and how he did not really fight fire with fire. That's been an interesting thought of mine for some time, that people want to fight fire with fire. And immediately I think you must fight fire with water, not fight fire with fire. You just create more fire. And I do know that they have scheduled burns and things like that to fire breaks. I realize that. But in the normal circumstance, if there's a fire somewhere, the first thing you want to grab, if not a fire extinguisher, is going to be water. And so we want to put it out with water. And so when I think of our Lord in his meekness, I think that his silence isn't cowardice, it's not pusillanimity, it's not an indifference or careless, unconcerned about what is taking place. But I think our Lord is truly concerned for the soul of the sinner, the one who is offending him. And so he prays for the sinner as he hung upon the cross. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So I think we must be careful not to misconstrue our Lord's silence as giving consent or meekness, or it is meekness. It is not cowardice. It's not an indifference. Our Lord is very much concerned. And so we need to imitate Christ. We need to be in that disposition, because every day we're going to have our cross, and a lot of times those crosses come from those near and dear to us, and we must practice that meekness. You know, if we are insulted, not to, give tit for tat?
Eye for an eye.
An eye for an eye. Insult for insult, injury for injury. We want to avoid that. And rather than returning evil for evil, we should always return something good. Two wrongs don't make it right.
And it's interesting. I think from there, if it's all right with you, I'm going to read on, because I think what is written here from My Catholic Faith is a great follow-up. Meekness is patience between man and man. It is related to the cardinal virtue of temperance, and is opposed to the sin of anger. The patient man keeps calm in the midst of vicissitudes. I was reading it before. I thought I would get it. Of life, he preserves his cheerfulness for the love of God. The motive is important. If we are calm and patient only because we hope to be admired or because we thereby wish to avoid temporal trouble by indifference, then we do not practice virtue. Virtue is the result of love for God, doing things for his sake, because it is his law or desire. By your patience, you will win souls. St. Luke chapter 21, verse 19. So I think that's an interesting point, that how we can easily get carried away with just the exterior. I mean, trying to look patient when you're, if you're fuming inside, maybe, there's a balance there. Obviously, if someone angers you, or they do something to upset you.
Biting your tongue is a good place to start.
Right. Which, and I know people are frustrating. We all frustrate each other, but I mean, where's the balance? Because this comes up a lot. When people are that specifically are in sin, let's say, for example, and I saw this on social media not that long ago, which it's also kind of a falsehood, I suppose, because it talked about how those who are homophobic, which we don't have to get into all of that, but though being against homosexuality is not homophobic, because a phobia is a fear of something. We're not afraid of. I'm fear for them and what's going to happen to them in eternity. But it talked about the homophobics are filled with hatred. Well, then they go, but hatred is against God's law. So maybe you should pray your hatred away, because they're basically saying to those who pray the homosexuals away, maybe they should focus on praying their hatred away. And these are things that we do probably encounter to some degree in our lives, whether it's homosexuality or any serious sin, if you will, or even minor sin. But I think any parent that's guiding their young child to do right or wrong knows that flying off the handle and chewing them out is not going to necessarily stop them from making that same sin again. It's actually being encouraging and also really teaching them to just practice virtue. Because if you actually want to know, love, and serve God, it won't be hard to avoid sin. So I guess, what is our personal responsibility to those whom we know, those whom we may even love, who have decided to choose a life of, I guess, for lack of a better word, depravity? I mean, I encountered this personally, and I, as I explained to someone that asked about it, what you will find in time, those people it's not you that ends the friendship, it's them. Mm-hmm. I told a friend of mine, it's like, look, if you're asking me to tell you that this is okay, that God accepts this, God made you this way, and you'll still get into heaven, I cannot do that. I cannot lie to you. Don't ask me to lie to you. I feel like that was probably the most, that's an example of meekness to something. Because the sin angers me. I remember talking about this with Father Bernard years ago, bringing that up. I was like, what do I do? He said, well, it's hate the sin, not the sinner. And obviously, as I said, it wasn't really long after that we no longer hung out. I wasn't going to go to the places he liked to go. And he's the one that dropped the friendship, not me. Mm-hmm. I still pray for this young man. And it just seems like, is that enough? But what else can you do?
Really, when you're dealing with other people, that is about all we can do, is to let them know where we stand, and really encourage them to understand, I love you, and I'm willing to suffer all of this. If you want to break up the friendship, if my friendship means that little to you, I'm willing to endure all this, because I must stand with what is right, but I only do this because I love you. I am telling you the truth because I love you. And love hurts, the truth hurts. Yeah. But yes, we must approach this not with any anger in our heart. And again, that gets us back to the idea that, I'm sorry things have turned out this way. I'm not sorry about what I said.
Right.
I'm sorry that it has gotten to this pass where you will no longer speak to me or deal with me. I've come across this really my entire priestly life, dealing with traditionalist parents who want to disown their children. I'm not going to talk to my children. They're heretics. They're this, they're that. I think, well, how are you going to help them if you won't even talk to them? If you will not meet with them, or not let them into your house, if you break off all ties of communication, you have no hope of converting them. And so you have to leave that means of communication open. Well, the faith is more important to me than my family is, and it should be. But you must not condemn them to hell because of your obstinacy, because of your anger, your frustration, your fear. We need to let your children know that you love them. Yes, you're hurt by whatever it is they're doing, the position they've taken. That's fine. Let them know that that hurts you. But let them also know that it hurts you because you love them. We can be quiet and silent in the face of all kinds of adversity, but it does not always denote that we're being meek. Sometimes silence is also a defiance.
Like the what's the word I'm looking for? The silent treatment. Oof.
Yeah. Well, that is more not defiance. That's more of a punishment.
Yeah, that's true too. Well, I would say it's still defiance if you're not actually trying to communicate with the person you're angry with.
But in essence, you are trying to communicate something by your
being
silence.
Yes.
Your silence speaks volumes.
Oof. I just get a shiver up my spine because if you really want to hurt me, just give me the silent treatment.
All right. Well, we don't want to do that, but
no.
It is really an interior thing that we need to focus on. This meekness. We can't really judge it by the externals. Being silent and patient when somebody is hurting you, accosting you, poking at you, trying to get your anger up. That patience has to be something that's internal. We can defiantly remain silent. That accusation does not even deserve a response. No. I'm not going to dignify that response or that accusation with a response.
So it's not even just like the person who's angry that also needs to practice meekness, but the person that's being attacked needs to practice the weakness or the meekness too. Yes. I mean, you don't always have to accept the invitation of every invite you're extended. I mean, and I was just thinking while you're talking about the families whose children have chosen things that obviously the Catholic Church does not approve of. I mean, really natural law does not approve of. And I can understand where parents would, it's definitely hard because, you definitely want to keep the door open, but you also don't want to seem like, well, you can be broken down. Like what's, well, if you let that slide, it's just scary because, I mean, I remember, and I remember, but I don't remember. I'm sorry. It was brought to my attention sometime as an adult that we as Catholics should not go to the homes of a couple who's not married. And I never thought about that before. I don't know, like maybe some certain circumstances, but if they're obviously
openly living in fornication,
right, you should not be going to their home. Okay. So whereas, obviously someone who's living a homosexual lifestyle, of course, just because they're identifying as something doesn't mean they're acting on it. But if they're openly
living this lifestyle,
yeah, their home decor, I mean, you should not go to their home. I mean, I wouldn't feel comfortable. I don't think they'd be comfortable having you there. But the parent that child is going through this period of time, I mean, there's just a lot they'd have to juggle with because, like, well, I want to bring my boyfriend, girlfriend. I mean, the right answer is no, right? I mean,
well, the parents have to set boundaries, and we have to abide by those boundaries. They don't have to be written in stone.
Okay.
And again, I would like to deal with that on an individual
I was going to
basis.
say that's just not.
What is your relationship with your child? And again, with disciplining children, I tell parents, you're going to have to rely on your understanding of your child. You know your child better than I do. If you cooperate with the grace of God and you're acting out of a motive of charity, then go for it. Some children need, a smack upside the head. Some of them need just a gentle reminder. Some of them need to see that you are really and sincerely hurt. They need to see that tears in your eyes, that the pain that they've caused you, and maybe that is enough. And there are others that are just going to be so blatant and brazen, that defiant, if you will, that it will not get to them, and it will take time for that to sink in. But parents have to set boundaries, and they have to make sure that the children understand these boundaries will not be crossed without consequence. You go across this, then here are the consequences. I tell parents frequently, I said, the worst thing you can tell your children, if you do that, I'm going to kill you. Because if they do it, you have to kill them. Otherwise, you are a liar. And any boundary that you've set, any rule that you set, means absolutely nothing.
Yep.
So if you're going to make a threat, make sure it's not an idle threat. Make sure it's one that you can carry through. This is the boundary. You cross the boundary. Here are the consequences.
Yep.
It needs to be reasonable. It needs to be proportionate. And it needs to be understood. You knew this was the boundary. You crossed it. Now you know the consequences. So it is not me imposing this punishment upon you. You have freely chosen this punishment yourself.
Right.
It's very much like someone when they get their license and they go speeding down the highway. You know, if you get caught speeding, you're going to get a ticket and you're going to have to pay a fine. The officer isn't the one who gave you the ticket.
No.
You gave it to yourself when you decided to exceed the speed limit.
Well, as another part here and I think this kind of goes into what you're saying, in my Catholic faith, the patient and meek man shows no anger when wrong is done him. He is a peacemaker at heart. However, although we should forgive and forget wrongs for the sake of peace, we must not give in to sin just to avoid opposing others. This would be simple. Let us keep the peace with all when there is no good reason to break it, and this should be our policy. So I think that just kind of goes in hand to what you said there. Because I've seen, let's just take these extreme things out of the picture. Although I'm glad you did point out that this is really something you deal with on an individual basis. Is there's really no nothing you can really just cover it all. So if you're dealing with that, seek individual counsel. But taking out like these big things, we've seen for centuries that people have done quite interesting things under the name of God, under the, so that there's respect to the Blessed Sacrament, what have you. And yet they're so passionate, but I would say they're angry. Has there ever really been a time to really like raise your voice, get into a shouting match over things that are sacred and holy? Like, for example, because I know you've dealt with this over the years too. There's always, as long as there's going to be children, there's going to be extra noise in church. And that's something that eventually will taper off as a child gets older. And it's funny to me how quickly adults of varying ages forget what it was like when they brought up children, or, and I realize the older ear does get sensitive. And I even look at it myself, how things that didn't bother me when I was 20, and I'm not really referring to the children in church, but just generally speaking, you find things more annoying the older you get. So it's having patience with both sides. But I've seen people absolutely scold at others because they feel like you're not doing enough to keep your children in line. It's disrespecting the mass. And part of me wants to ask the people who've taken that direction, what did you think was going to come from that? That's not what God's calling us to do in defending our faith, defending him. Sorry.
Well, I think it's more often than not, it's an attempt to hide or cover up or deal with their own inadequacy. You see, I was at Mass today, and I could not keep my mind on what was going on. My mind wasn't on my prayers. And of course, it's not my own fault. It must have been that yelling child back there. That's all I could hear. That's all I could focus on, was the child kicking the bench, or the child moving around, or the toy the child was playing with, or the snacks that the mother brought and gave to the child. It was always someone else's fault that I cannot focus. And I mentioned in a sermon one time, I said, well, the saints went into ecstasy. And I understood that while they were in ecstasy in this intimate communion with God, that people could walk by, there would be all kinds of noises, all kinds of distraction, and they could not bring them out of the ecstasy until they were ready to return, because they were so focused, so engaged in their prayer, in their meditation, in this talk they were having with God. It is as if the entire world fell away. And that is something I think that we should all try to strive for in our prayers, so that I'm not distracted. Many years ago, I remember an elderly man telling me about the noise. Did you hear this one or that one in the church while I was saying Mass? No, I didn't hear them. My mind is focused on pronouncing the words correctly, going through all the ceremonies and the ritual and getting everything down, and doing it well so that it is pleasing to God. And really, I was so focused on that I don't really hear what's going on.
And it's interesting because, often people want to blame the children, but I find adults, if not more, distracting. So the thing is, we all have something that probably annoys somebody else.
Well, on the other hand, I did grow up in a large family with a lot of activity and noise going on around, and you kind of learn to block it out.
Yes.
You want to read a book, and yes, there are children playing, there's this noise going on. You have to learn to study at the kitchen table while all these other things are going on around you.
Really, you can't expect the world to cater to you. And that's a message that I think an older generation likes to put on the younger children, because they claim that we're so entitled. But all it is just entitlement on a different thing. And we say, but this is for something holy. This is for God. But it's really pride. It's about you. But you do learn to sound things out, because I've done that. I remember Father and Anthony, I used to work together, and he would be working in the back singing. And a couple people would ask me, like, doesn't that bother you with all of his singing? I'm like, he's singing? I didn't even notice. I learned to tune him out. Sorry, Father, but it still happens to this day. But that's the thing. Only you can control you. Not every environment is going to be what you expect. I do understand that you go into church and you're hoping to really draw closer to God during it. But at the same time, and here, adults too. I mean, how many of you are talking in church, even when Mass is over, you're in the back? And I'm talking about unnecessary talking. I mean, if you need to correct your child, or you need to get someone in an emergency, that's okay. But carrying on a conversation, even if it's in the back of the church, is still church. So,
and there are probably someone in the pew still trying to pray.
Yes.
And you are becoming a distraction to them. And if your correction becomes worse than the crime that you're trying to correct, what have you accomplished? But you've just made matters worse.
And I know you often talk about how, because this comes up a lot when I talk to you about, like, when I get distracted, and you remind me God appreciates the struggle. Well, God knows exactly what's going on in that struggle too. Like, he knows that you might like a little bit more silence than you're being given. And you can ask him right then and there, Lord, I can't focus. Please help me, or just do the best with what I have. Help me to be kinder about this, because don't let me stew over this. Because really, I think it's your stewing that actually is louder in your mind than anything else. So,
well, I told children when they tell me, well, my sermons are too long, they can't follow it, it's too hard for them to follow. I said, well, then you can pray. Well, what do we pray? I said, well, while the bishop is preaching, you can ask God to help Bishop Giles remember the word amen and be quiet. You can pray to God that maybe he'll say something that you will understand. But even if you can't listen and participate and get anything out of the sermon, you can at least pray and ask God to give you the strength to be patient, to persevere. And you can turn this, what would otherwise be a very negative experience, into something that is positive.
Yes. I mean, I think and we probably all have one or two people that really, get to us, that's the time to pray for them. And because again, we're all fallen creatures. We all have our quirks and things that, can drive us crazy. But I don't know if I said it on an episode with you, but you're no picnic either. Just whatever, you probably see someone that really, really gets to you. You are someone else's thorn. So even if you don't intend to be, I mean, sometimes people just straight up clash.
Yeah, sometimes just your voice, and there's nothing you can do about it.
The way you breathe, the way you stand, definitely. So, because it started off with it's one of the Beatitudes. So I went over the Beatitudes with a student of mine, and we talked about meekness, and it's also self-control, right? And so one of my questions to her is like, well, if you stub your toe on the door and get really angry and then hit the door, are you practicing meekness? And she's like, no. Good. I mean, what's the sense in getting angry at something that hurts you, especially inanimate objects, like losing your temper
and throwing things
or someone cuts you off in traffic. Really, and then you accelerate. Is that practicing meekness because you want to follow them and make sure you know that what they did was wrong? I don't know. People have very strong reactions, but I would say for a Catholic, we need to do better. We need to aim higher.
I like to think that two wrongs do not make it right. You sinning is not going to help them overcome their sin.
Well, but
it just becomes a competition, one to outdo the other. Yes. You insulted me, I'm going to insult you more. And then you can insult me more, and then I will insult you more. And it's a competition to what? Outdo each other in sin?
Do you think it's because both have the delusion that, well, mine is justifiable anger? I mean, if you got in your head, well, I'm passionate about this and it's justifiable because it pertains to such and such and such, and the opposing also has it's justifiable. So I think things accelerate because you think that your cause the motives are pure.
When they're mostly not, if you would stop and examine your conscience. Why am I really this angry? Am I this angry because God was insulted? Or am I this angry because I have been slighted? I have been insulted.
Right. I've had a bad day and I'm going to take it out on someone. I think this quote from St. Bonaventure might fit in here. And if it doesn't, oh well. Beware of becoming vexed or impatient at the faults of others, for it would be folly when you see a man falling into a ditch to throw yourself into another to no purpose.
Yep, two wrongs don't make it right.
No.
Your sin doesn't justify me sinning along with you.
It's just, the saying goes, you catch more flies with honey. Why would, and you have to look at how do you respond to a correction? Because as you pointed before, each child is different, but so is every adult. Some adults need maybe for you to candidly speak to them like this is where you're wrong and this is where we need to figure it out. Some just need to slap upside the head. Of course, I would like to think adults, there should be more conversation, but civil conversation. But of course, if you already have a bad history with someone.
And a lot is in context.
Yes.
We want to try and correct individuals in private rather than in public, because we want to preserve their good name.
Right.
And if we're truly motivated by charity, we're not out to destroy them. We're not out to get them. We are here to try and help them. And we think perhaps a gentle word or even a stern word is exactly what they need. But often we want others to be witness to see how good we are. You see, we are on the virtuous plane and we're trying to help and correct. well, you are destroying this person's good name,
Yes.
this person's reputation, and there's naturally the natural reaction is to fight fire with fire. You hit me, I'm going to hit you back harder. So it becomes this public display of anger and frustration, which is not Christ-like. It's not virtuous. It is demonic.
Definitely. I just find it interesting how, different ways just to make a difference in your child. I mean, some just have to. I had another thought and it just left me, so I was kind of covering and it's not working. So
I try and tell mothers with their children, especially your little boys, if they can see that you're really hurt, you don't have to say a word.
Right. Genuinely hurt. Don't be like fake crying on them, but
they'll pick up on fake crying.
Yes.
But they have to see that you are in pain because of them, and they will feel great remorse for that.
But a lot of that works also what you do when they're young, and I part of the reason why this series is so important to me, because we can go over all the catechism and you can memorize all the things you need to memorize, but if you're not striving to live a virtuous life, striving for virtue to therefore really know, love, and serve God, to me that just seems very empty. So if we do try to encourage virtue even at a young age, talk about it, encourage it, I think then you will be able to work with your child. Then you'll have an effect like that. I mean, your mother, I'm assuming, held a very good standard that was very clear. And
well, today happens to be the feast of Saint Monica, so I
does.
can't help but bring up Saint Monica.
Yes.
One of the meditations on Saint Monica I've shared with a few women, wives over the years, usually to not very much success, but I am really impressed with that one meditation, morality extracted from the Confessions of St. Augustine. And one point he speaks of St. Monica's, meekness, the control that she gained over her husband. I think his name was Patricius. Patricius was an alcoholic. He was a violent tempered man. But the meditation says that Patricius had never struck Monica. And it was very common for husbands to beat their wives, for wives to have, a swollen lip or black eye from a drunken husband that they were foolish enough to confront in his drunken anger. But these neighbor women came to St. Monica and asked her, we know what your husband is, he's cheating on you, he's drunk, he's angry, violent.
He was a pagan.
He was a pagan, yes. But we don't understand why you don't have all the bruises and the abuse that we're getting from our husbands. And St. Monica relates to them that she sees her husband as her master, forgive me, but yes, the head of her family, whom she has married, she has promised to obey, but she sees him as part of herself. She saw his faults as her own. She would do penance for his faults because they are not two individuals, but they are one. And she would ask, what could I have done to make this better for him? And she made a rule to herself that she would never accost him, confront him when he was drunk. She would always wait to make any suggestion to him. She would wait until he was sober, until it was the right moment. The right moment to tell your husband that he is drunk and no good is not when he is drunk.
Okay.
You have to wait till he's sober and he is receptive. But St. Monica never hid the fact that every one of his sins, every one of his evil ways hurt her, that they caused her pain. And she did this because she would do penance for them. Whatever she observed that her husband did wrong, she would pray to God. She would do penance. She would mortify herself. And in this way, she gradually won an ascendancy over her husband. He could not strike her because she was doing nothing to provoke him.
Yeah.
He had no reason to. And then when he would offend her and he would see that his sins offended her, it would sting his own conscience. And Father Guru points out in his meditation that Patricius reached a point when he would now ask Monica's help. Help me not to do this again. Show me what I must do. He would seek her advice, which really is that equality that women are looking for. Yes, he's still the man. He's still the head of the house. He's still her master, if you will. But this master now requires her help, her assistance. And he's asking for this. And she eventually, not only does she gain this ascendancy over him, but she brings him to the church. She brings him to the baptismal font. And that was her goal. She was doing all of this for Christ, and she was loving her husband for Christ. So it is a lot about how we approach the problem. You see, Monica's neighbor wives did not approach the problem correctly, in my opinion. I'm sure that, yes, every case is different. And as the women would tell me, my husband is different. The situation is different. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
But that's not the point of the meditation.
Right. Because I could personally see, obviously not in that same situation, but I could see how that's really hard to hear. Absolutely hard to hear. But I believe that
even as a seminarian before I was a priest, the thought hit me in that meditation. You see, I'm not going to be a husband. I'm not going to be a wife, but I am going to be a priest. And now I'm going to be hearing people's confessions. I will know their sins. And if I'm not helping them to get better, then there's something wrong with me. What have I done? And really, is this person's sin my responsibility now? If I had given better advice in the confessional, would this person have avoided falling into this sin again? If I had prepared my sermon better and given a better sermon, if I had given better instruction, if I had given better example, could I have prevented this? And I think I don't want to go down this rabbit hole because it can lead you to some very dark places. But parents need to consider, my child has sinned because I have failed. It's not my child who has failed. I have failed my child. My child is not disappointed in me. I have let myself down because I have failed to properly instruct, to properly lead, to properly guide my child. And so this is my fault, for which I should do penance, which I should pray for. Yes, my child should see that I am hurt, that I am wounded, but I am more, you might say, angry with myself than with my child. And we can apply this, I think, really across the board with any of us that have authority over others. Maybe if I had explained it better.
Yes. It's interesting that you brought that up, the burdens of a priest, because often I see out there that, the idea is like, well, priests really can't counsel married people because they don't understand the burdens. Maybe, you have similar burdens because you're responsible for all these souls under you, and you as a bishop, it's even more so. So I'm glad you brought that up because it shows that you do understand. You absolutely do understand and I, even for myself in teaching, it's like, am I really doing the best I can? Am I doing what I can to reach them? What can I do to support parents? When I used to teach in Wisconsin, it definitely felt like a huge burden because, you only get that one day a week and you can see that there's not a whole lot of progress and you still feel very responsible. Like it's my fault. It's not happening. I was told, that, but it's still on the parents. So then it's like, well, now my mind says like, well, what can I do to help the parents to teach their children? Because a lot of us now are coming up. It's like, yeah, we need more guidance. We need to figure out. And I've seen people actually themselves take, excuse me, take their faith more seriously. And that's going to pass along to their child. It's just, at the end of the day, we have to realize it just takes time. Everything we do, it's not immediate. St. Monica waited for years on the conversion of her husband and her son. I know we don't want that. We want it right now, just like we want the magic pill to take our headache away, when it really you have to look at the root cause. So, but it's it's a lot to think about and what we can do to really make things better for everyone else.
Well, learn of Christ and be meek and
And
humble of
I mean,
heart.
that's really, and that's part of what I thought with the young lady I'm getting ready for confirmation. One of the projects we're doing is going over the story that she has of her patron saint, and I did it with mine. And we're going over the 7 gifts of the Holy Ghost and trying to go and show like how you, from the story you read, how your patron saint is practicing those gifts, using those gifts. And I think that, and in turn, we can see how we can imitate our saint who's imitating Christ. So therefore we can get into heaven. That's my goal. I'm trying to stretch our thinking a little bit. I found it pretty helpful. I plan to explain it more in another time. But
we have to be patient with ourselves, I think, first. And I think a lot of the times we strike out at others, it's really because of our own guilty conscience.
yes,
We're fighting against someone else. You're making me look bad. The sister likes the story. She gets, as a child, was disciplined because she embarrassed her father.
mm-hmm.
And so her father went perhaps
I wasn't
overboard.
even a child. I was like 14, 15.
Went overboard on the correction because he was embarrassed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's pretty common for anyone in authority. My subordinate, my child, is an embarrassment to me. And therefore, I have to make an example so that everyone knows that I'm not at fault.
Mm-hmm.
It's my child is just no good. This is the child that God has given me. So it's really God's fault. It's not my fault. It's God's fault for giving me this rebellious child.
And I will say, it's not that I necessarily like the story in a sense I like it, but it's the development of it since, because, and my dad won't mind. I won't get into details, but hi, Dad. I know you listen to the podcast, but I was about 14 or 15, and you're right. It was a huge reaction. But looking back, I was like, I know why he did that, because he was humiliated. And he had to right then and there show all the people who were witnesses that I can still put my child in place. And really, quite honestly, it was so severe in the sense that I'm surprised I didn't start bawling my eyes out. But I was probably at 15, I knew everything. And you're not gonna upset me. And it ended up being this whole thing. But years later, my father and I do talk about this, not every chance we get, but it does come up in the sense that, because it was one of those things where if I wanted to, I could have let that impact my relationship with my father and really my mother the rest of my life. It's the kind of thing where I'm going to go no contact with my parents because of this. It was kind of like that. But again, you realize looking back, yes, was I completely right? No. Was my father completely right? No. But both human, made a mistake. We've moved on. He still loves me. I still love him. And really, you grow with your child. I mean, you don't get a child and know exactly what to do with that child. And of course, you get a different child with every child you have, because, my parents got pretty lucky with James, and then they had me, and then they had the father and our other brother who's known as Thunder and Lightning. So that'll tell you a lot about what we put our father and mother through. But lessons were learned all around because it involved my grandparents too. It was such a mess. But what came, we're all better for it looking back.
Hopefully.
Yes. I mean, I suppose it's not over yet. And I suppose I could still, or my father's going to be like,
you had to make this public?
Well, I wasn't really good. It's funny that you brought it up, because I was like, yeah, I kind of know what you're talking about. And then you bring up the story, but it happened. It was a long time ago, and we're fallen creatures. You do look back on how there's just comes a point where you realize your parents are human too. And they're working long hours and trying to provide a good home for you. And it's not easy. And when you're a kid, you don't have the same, you have your own difficulties, your own struggles. And sometimes I think we lose sight of that as adults at the children. But
I do believe that the parents feel their failure in their children, and they're more angry with themselves. They're just taking it out on their children. And I think this is where the practice of humility and meekness comes to play, that we have to realize, I need to take this out on myself. I need to accept the responsibility. I need to accept the burden. I'm the one who needs to do the penance. Even if your child is at fault, perhaps my doing penance for that child will help him, as St. Monica did penance for her husband.
Well, wouldn't you say that's also the prime example of imitating Christ? Because he did take that burden. He suffered for us, and he actually did nothing wrong. We know that, but that's part of the imitation of him, is bearing that burden, doing something to hopefully someday will make a difference. Because I always look back that someone was praying awfully hard for me when I was through my teenage to like 28. Honestly, I was not a very pleasant person, I suppose. But, and I think it was my godmother, who was my grandmother primarily. But we're talking like 14 years of me figuring myself out as how I wanted to be as really a human being, eventually seeing it as who do I want to be as a creature of God. And God had to be at the center of it, no matter what vocation I was going to choose. It wasn't until I realized that until I make God the center, nothing else was going to make sense. I was not going to have that peace, that joy, consolation, if you will. Not that life is all roses. We have to expect those tribulations, but he will be there with us. We can do all things in him who strengthens us. So, and people are like, that sounds cliche, but I really believe it.
It is true.
So, well, this kind of took a direction I really wasn't expecting, but that's okay. I guess that makes it more interesting.
We recently had a marriage, and it happened to be a Sunday gospel was about the Good Shepherd. And so I had to work that into my marriage sermon.
It's beautiful.
Really, that the father has to be the husband. The father has to be the Good Shepherd. He needs to stand there, draw the line in the sand, and say, I will die here. I will die defending my wife, my children, because I am a good shepherd, as Christ laid down his life for him, for his flock, and so I must lay down my life for my flock. And really, to Christ, the good shepherd, knows the voice of his sheep, and the sheep know his voice. But the good shepherd does not run and flee when there is danger, but he is ready to stand and fight. And really, that's what a husband is promising on his wedding day. I'm giving my entire life, my comfort, everything. I am ready to put on the line, and I'm ready to lose it all. And I do this for the love of God. Yes, for the love of my spouse, but principally for the love of God. And it is the love of God that is going to sustain me and enable me to be this good shepherd, to lay down my life for my sheep. The love of a wife or another human being isn't, I think, enough to give us that courage to lay down our life. It has to be a love for God. Because really, I look in this world and I say, there is nothing in this world that's really worth dying for. And then, of course, if I say that, then I come to the conclusion that if there's nothing worth dying for, there's nothing worth living for. But ultimately, I went through all of that in my teenage years, trying to figure all this out. But ultimately, we have to do this for the love of God. We live for the love of God. We need to be ready to die for the love of God. And that makes everything in this world worthwhile. That's what gives value to everything, is because we're doing it for God. With God, we are in the presence of God. And that is what gives vitality to everything in this world. And when we begin to strip God out little by little, this world loses its savor. It's disgusting. It's frustrating. And we want, Lord, stop the world. Let me off. I'm getting tired of this. It's making me dizzy. It's just the same garbage, round and round and round. But I believe principally it's the love of God that's going to give us that patience, that will give us that humility, that will give us that meekness that we need in this world with all its crosses and frustrations and anxiety. We can deal with all of that when we cooperate with God.
It does work out a lot better that way if you just say yes.
Yes.
Thy will be done. So, anything else you'd like to add, Your Excellency? I mean, I feel like we could go on.
We could go on and on.
But, well, what would your advice be, though, to those? Because, unfortunately, it's not an uncommon thing, and it's not necessarily the husband's falling short, and I know that there's no, blanket answer to this, but just maybe a little encouragement to those whose spouses aren't living up to what God expects us to do. How do you keep going? Especially more commonly, the husband does not take the role of the good shepherd. How can the mother still? I mean, I know you could bring back Saint Monica, but maybe make it a little little different.
Well, I think we must remind ourselves that two wrongs aren't going to make it right. Tit for tat isn't going to work. Really, we need God's presence. And how can I bring God's presence? Well, I need to redouble my efforts. I can't nag and force someone to do something against their will. There's very little, if any, merit in that for them. But of my own choice, I can redouble my prayers. I can redouble my efforts. I can put forth more. I tell married couples in pre-Cana classes that it can't be 50-50. You have to be willing to give 100%. Mm-hmm. Give yourself completely to this marriage. As the good shepherd, be ready to lay down your life. You may not be the husband and put in charge, but the wife, no less, has to be that good shepherd and be ready to die for Christ, for her husband, because she loves God, she loves her husband, she is ready to do everything, to give her all, to give everything she has to make this work. As Christ gave his all, so she should be ready to give her all. What that all is, it's going to be different in individual cases, but undoubtedly, I think we could pray more. We could pray better. We could turn even our daily chores or what we do at work or in the world, we can turn all of that into a prayer if we just simply make the intention of doing it.
Right. The morning offering covers that quite well. And then we talk about short prayers throughout the day. It just kind of brings to my mind and I saw this years ago, and I think it was more guided toward married couples, but I can see it's for us all. If you want to see something, especially let's just take it on a spiritual thing. If you want your husband to grow closer to God, don't pray for his change. Pray that, or for him to be a better husband, pray for you to be a better wife, whatever that might be, a better spouse, and vice versa. So if you want to, if the friendships, you have a friendship that there's trouble, you have to look inwardly to yourself. Well, what's my contribution to the difficulty? What can I change that will improve it? We all are learning much about ourselves and constantly changing. But I mean, I'm not saying don't pray for your spouse and pray for them to know, love, and serve God, but also just ask, your first prayer should be for yourself, that want to know, love, and serve God better. Kind of like, don't put on the airplane, they tell you put your oxygen mask on first before you help someone else. Make sure that you're being a faithful Catholic, receiving the sacraments, which will give you strength to endure really every daily occurrence. We can't do it without depending on Christ.
And if we are truly living the faith and there is now joy in our heart, our loved ones will want that. Mm-hmm. What is your secret to keep this positive, upbeat attitude? What is it? It's my faith. Well, it's more than that. It is your love for God, your love for the church. It is the love of the faith, but it is all these things combined. You want to know my secret? Come with me. And I think there are many stories like that, with two men working, and the one seems to get all this stuff done, and the other one's working overtime and really pushing himself, and he can't seem to get it done. He says, well, what's your secret? And the man says, well, you follow me a day,
come to my house
days.
the next morning and I'll show you.
So the first thing they do is go to Mass. And then they went into the field and they did their labors, and he saw that there were angels helping this man because he had gone to Mass. He put God first, and then everything else fell in its place. And if we learn to do that, it's amazing what we can accomplish. We can do all things in him who strengthens us.
Yes, and obviously I realize daily Mass is not always an option for people, but that's no excuse to not make time for your morning offering and giving yourself even 5 minutes a day in the morning just to give it all to God.
You can make spiritual communions.
Yes.
You can
that's one of the best things you could do.
Attend Mass.
Send your guard. I believe there's a prayer card somewhere. Send your guardian angel to Mass, or send your angel to Mass. So, and it's just one of those things that you may not get an immediate result, but just keep trying. And I think oftentimes we expect a big change, and then when we look back, it's like, oh yes, things did gradually get better even from day one, but we're better off not getting a big swooping change. We really need the gradual, the slow but steady, kind of like when they talk about weight loss. Yes, it'd be great to lose 30 pounds in 30 days, but if you don't, anyone will tell you if they ever lost that much weight, the second you change anything, that restriction, the weight's going to come back off. But if you go slow and steady and learn how to maintain, the payoff is better. So, and that's how our faith works. Slow and steady, be consistent. Consistency is always important. And trust and be faithful.
Be patient.
Be patient.
Be humble.
Be humble.
And be meek, since this is about meekness.
The meekness. I think we covered meekness pretty good. So, anything else, Your Excellency?
So we say Deo gratias.
I think we should say Deo gratias if you will leave us with your blessing.
Benedictio de omnipotentis, Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti descendet super vos, et manet semper. Amen.
Thank you.
You're welcome.